as I said just now, this will be very interactive. So actually, the two names on the agenda were just to lure you here, but you will actually be the ones who will have to do the work, and we will just stand here and look nice. My name is Marcus Jenal. I am part of the BEAM team. Most of you or all of you have seen me this morning. I work on monitoring, evaluation, and evidence. And systemic change is obviously a big part of this. Systemic change has been part of the BEAM as long as evidence, so meaning from the beginning. It's been an important topic. We've been working on it, doing different things around the topic of systemic change, what it is, how we can get there, and how we measure it. So I'm very curious to not be contributing for a moment, but also to harvesting a little bit of what others think is systemic change, how we can get there, and how we measure it. We have also been teaming up with USAID's LEO projects. I'm very happy that Ben Fowler can be here with me to lead you through this session.
Hi there. So as Marcus said, Ben Fowler, work with Market Share Associates, and one of the reasons that I'm here is because LEO has been collaborating with BEAM since it started in about 2014, 2013. And so we've been doing quite a number of activities around this area. We started with a literature review that was looking at, what is the evidence around how evaluations have sought to assess systemic changes in long-running market systems development projects. More recently, looking at that and really understanding that there isn't that much, or there hadn't been that much out there in terms of evidence on that, we have started managing a number of tool trials, which are testing different tools as a mechanism for actually capturing systemic change. So I think, I speak for both Marcus and myself that we're really interested to hear from this group, and I think get a lot of perspectives that perhaps haven't come up yet in terms of how you're seeing this and what kind of processes you're using or that you think would be appropriate to use in your own contexts. So crowdsourcing a little bit.
So the method we're using today is called the World Cafe. Some of you might already have heard about it. Some of you might have actually used it already. It's not very difficult. But there's a couple of rules. So there's going to be 3 rounds with 3 questions, 1 question per round. We have already a very evenly distribution around the room. That's very good. Now what we need to do is each of the tables needs to select or elect, if you're democratic, a table host. Now the idea is the host will stay with the table for the whole 3 rounds, and all the other people will rotate. So the people who don't want to stand up and walk around can volunteer as hosts. So the host will stay at the table all 3 rounds. The other people will rotate between each round, which we will announce. And it's not that one table as a whole in corporate moves, but you will mix up with new people, so you will in each round you have a new group together. So the way it works is that there will be a question, which you will see here, and then you discuss at the table. You have 15 minutes, and you have 2 big flip chart papers and markers on the table. So you're pleased to doodle or write or paint, or no, there's no paint, but just be creative. Try to capture what you're saying, what you're discussing. Try to capture similarities. Try to capture diversity. Try to illustrate things, not just to write. So we have a nice little present for after the conference as well. We can take home. After 15 minutes, I will come back to you, and then we'll have the rotation, then the next question will come. But the first thing, once the new group sits at the table, is that the table host, who remains there, will have a brief presentation of the things that have already been discussed.
Materials, so the need to draw boundary line definitely became very apparent. It's also a known concept in thermodynamics. You need to definitely draw your boundary line before you make assessments. Yeah? So the question we had was, do we measure the impact at the intervention level, or do you zoom out and really put your boundary line at the sectoral level? Yeah? So it relates also the changes in one intervention might not necessarily happen at the sectoral level. So it also, the concept of boundary line also speaks to the challenge we have also on environmental issues. Clear boundary line.
It's very rare that one particular intervention sort of triggers systemic change. It's one intervention triggers a kind of change which could push yourself towards something more systemic in the long run.
But you've just developed a whole new methodology for assessing this. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about is like also really defining like what is the change that you want to see with a particular group of actors, and and really focusing in on that. So maybe that's kind of expanding on the volume and the quality, but with not just across like not being vague and saying we want to see this change across like the system, but like systemically, sustainably, when you're not there any longer, what will these people be continuing to do without your support?
Yeah.
So I think maybe that's the sustainability aspect of it.
Yeah. We sort of have 6 parameters, which sustainability is one of them. Autonomy. So basically, that's a breakdown of this quality and volume. So I guess different people might have different terms, but what we use
Autonomy, scale, or scale for beneficiary, sustainability, resilience, scale.
Autonomy, sustainability, resilience, scale, inclusiveness, and women's economic.
I'm not speaking so much from a practitioner perspective, more from we just presented during the lunch session, I don't know if you were there, a research piece that we do on how to design interventions that we do from Beam. And one thing that we found is that there's a bit of can be a confusion between changing a system and a systems change and a systemic change.
Yeah.
And I think there we have to be careful to distinguish between that. And what I found now, one of the answers I like, well, a systemic change should be to some extent related to the pro impact. Because why are we trying to change a system if it doesn't have any impact on the poor?
For me, the key thing that shows that change is a systemic one is that it enables other constituencies to take advantage of it, even when they're not what you'd intended.
Yeah.
So that's what we're looking out for.
Absolutely.
So as soon as we say, hang on, these people have started doing this, but they couldn't have done it if we hadn't been doing this with this group, because what we're doing is not just designed for that group, it's changing the whole system.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The first 3 minutes for the host to explain what's on the paper, where the discussion has reached at that table so far. And then we'll take the next 10 minutes after that to switch to our second question, which is around the strategies that your program is taking in order to achieve systemic change. Okay?
Can you read it?
Yeah? Yeah, as if everyone's ready, let's just jump right in.
A single market system, which is seed sellers to farmers, or is it the entire soya?
I think it's the entire market system. That's one.
But you can have systemic change at each level, and your interventions will probably focus.
Exactly.
So next question,
so you
focus in.
basically focus at the overall market level, and then to achieve that higher level systemic change, you have to have individual interventions to make smaller changes.
But you could have 5 interventions to make the seed market work between seed and farmers.
Yeah.
But the farmer is one step in the entire soya system. the farmer buys seed, grows soya, sells soya to traders. Traders buy the soya, sell it to a processor. Processor processes the soya and sells soya cake or sells soy oil. That's the soya system. And we're just, and your objective is actually to maybe to change the entire soya system, to increase the volume of soybean being produced, the numbers of farmers producing it. That's where our beneficiaries come from.
So you have, these are your 3 system change areas, and you have different interventions to address constraints in these areas, which finally leads to this higher level systemic change at the vegetable farmers. So I think
the point is you need to define.
You need to first define the higher level change that you want to achieve, and then have systemic change areas addressing each of the constraints, the high level constraints that you're trying to address. For example, here, one constraint is access to input, so you work at the input market. Here, one,
Tell me this.
Sorry? Exactly.
Core market, the regulations, enforcements, and demand. It was then supplemented by pointing out that it's just a systems change, not a systemic change, if it doesn't have significant changes in benefits for the poor, and it doesn't result in increasing inclusion for youth and gender, and it doesn't include environmental growth. Okay, so there are all these caveats. It has to be in addressing each of those key issues. It was recognized that in cases where you have monopolistic markets, systemic change may require breaking monopoly power by introducing technologies or approaches that reduce the barriers to entry in a market, and that facilitation is key to any real systemic change, as opposed to just parachuting in a direct implementation alternative. So that was our take.
That's an interesting point. So no, you don't have to share the blame. It was suggested that it's about the process of addressing constraints. So systemic change is when you've got to those constraints. Obviously, you have to have your process of analysis first. But all those underlying causes that are not allowing those things that you just mentioned to happen. Once market actors start to change their behaviour in some way that actually addresses those, then that's a systemic change. But then that begs so many other questions, like what is a shift? Is it one crowd arena? In the thin market, or was it many? And then we got into a wider discussion about AAER, and we got quite interested. But I just wanted to make that one point first, so that people have a chance to talk.
Yeah, I think we had one, from the same group that he has tried to define. When we were looking at the framework, the AAER framework, one gave an example and said, oh no, how does that tally with the AAER, and at what level can we say this is a systemic change? So I think that's one of the debates that we had. I think it was a specific example on how a market actor would respond at what level. So it allowed us to reflect back on, for example, the innovations that we introduced into the market, like the pilot. So the question was, if we introduce an innovation, or if we pilot an innovation with a partner, and one partner adopts that innovation, at this level, are we saying the systemic change has started? Are we saying the market partner is adopting, or do we wait for other partners to start replicating or to start entering into the market or responding to the constraint that is being addressed in the market for us to be confident to say, okay, now this is systemic change going on? So there was that kind of a discussion in the first group that we had.
Just to add on to that, because there was a similar. In a related item was just time frame. So in that same line drawing exercise, is if you only have a year or 2 years or 3 years, is that enough time to really feel like you've demonstrated a systemic change versus just, you've got some adoption, you've got some people doing things, but is that really, do you feel confident that that is going to continue?
A little bit about that point at which within a bounded population of people it becomes systemic when it's reached a point of critical mass, and brought up the tipping point and the application of that theory, relevant or not. Not everybody agrees with it, but it being about 16% of a given population. So it's the innovators in the early majority of a specific population. So in terms of drawing a line in the sand.
Any more points to the first question? Otherwise we move on.
For my table, in the first part about defining the system, we'd struggled. We didn't have the succinct discussion that you guys had. So then when it came to this, we were struggling a bit to talk about strategies, but we just started kind of throwing things out. So, and then we started trying to talk about them as tactics versus strategies. But some of the things were like, a strategy or a tactic would be changing attitudes in the system. And then a couple of the strategies that came up was either the idea of pilots, so seeding an idea, starting small and doing a bunch of pilots and then seeing what catches fire, and then going big after that. And then, the other would be, the opposite of that was just like try to change a rule of the game and go big. And if you feel like you've got something that you can do that, just charge after it. You don't have to do something that's a small pilot. Then talked a bit about new networks, so like introducing people who wouldn't normally interact. We talked about healthy competition, so sometimes it's overly competitive in the marketplace, or it's not competitive enough. And so if you can see a direction, then try to help move the marketplace in the right direction. And then another tactic was buying down risk of trying new things, amplifying, or a strategy was amplify, demonstrate, amplify a demonstration effect. And then one of the last items as well was taking an iterative approach, which I think is just really about learning. So constantly reflecting on what you're doing and dropping what's not working is a strategy to really move towards systemic change.
Who wants to add on to that?
If the change that you're trying to achieve is increased income for farmers, then look at the market system and look at the systemic constraints in the market that are impeding the farmers of, creating barriers for the farmers to not achieve those higher incomes. So look at the higher level systemic change, and then look at the systemic constraints, and then define systemic change areas at different levels, which then contribute to the higher level systemic change. So it's very important that you look at the systemic constraints along with the higher level systemic change and the different systemic change areas in a market system.
If you're working on an intervention, not providing any grants to market actors to participate, but really rather kind of forcing them in a way to have some skin in the game so that they're actually acting as a real market player. And then the other thing that we talked about was really kind of finding the right entry point. So, if you're working across an entire value chain, in some contexts, it might be at intervening more at the government, at the policy level, and working on regulations to create that systemic change. And in other cases, it could be somewhere else in the value chain. Maybe it's a bottoms-up approach. Sometimes it's a top-down, and sometimes it's somewhere right in the middle. And maybe sometimes it's a combination, but finding that entry point is a key strategy.
I think in addition to what everyone else has said, we had a strong emphasis on having a strong theory of change, identifying the key actors and incentive structures that impact on their behavior, and then creating strategic alliances to enable change in those incentive structures.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for bringing so much to this session. For engaging for all the time and discussing, and on Friday afternoon. I really appreciate your energy. And one thing I also wanted to mention that we are working on is a research project on systemic change that is going on, which attempts to go back to the roots, if you want, and look at literature and some insights from other fields out of academia and different publications from the economy, but biology as well. So really look into the different fields and see what can we get into our discussion of systemic change that might actually help us either better define it, better knowing how to achieve it, or better measuring it, or ideally all of the three. So stay tuned. There will be things coming out on the Beam website on both initiatives.